Now that we've created a form and we've worked with all the most common form elements that you're going to find, and it's not all of them, but the most common ones that we're going to find, there are a few things that we want to look at. And if I'm looking at the form itself, it needs some help. And by help, I mean it needs some CSS styling. The information itself is good. We can follow it, all those types of things, but it probably could use some help in making it easier to be read and therefore used. Now, we're not going to worry about the layout of the form, and if you use some different types of CSS frameworks, whether it's something like Bootstrap or something else like that, a lot of them have different ways that we can group and organize our content. Instead, I just want to focus on some real basic things that we can do. So I'm going to come over here to my new styles, and we've already looked at some real simple things just with text area. And that, I think, is a great place to start. I might want to come in here and make some adjustments. For example, my max width, I might say, should be 750 instead of 500, just to get it with a little bit larger based upon how it needs to be. Same thing with max height, and I can make some further adjustments with that. But I'm going to ignore that for right now. What I want to look at first, though, is using labels. And labels are always a fun thing to work with because they provide information about the form fields. And there's a couple of different things that we can do, and I'll show you those. In a label, I like to go ahead and usually make them bold just so they're a little bit bigger. So I'll say font weight bold. And I'm also going to specify a minimum width. Now, by default, it's none, and so it's just a small little space, only whatever needs to be taken up. Instead, I'm going to say a minimum width of 175 pixels. You might say, well, why do I do something like that? Well, when I switch back to my browser and reload, you notice that it starts to spread things out just a little bit and make things a little bit more common in size. Now, I did not hit that size limit partially because I need to change how my layout is. So I'm going to have display. Instead of saying inline, I'm going to do inline block. Now when I reload, you can see that this content is further spread out. You might say, well, how does that help? Well, one way it helps is, for example, my radio buttons aren't so close together. Now I can clearly see, oh, this radio button goes with monthly, or I can see that this radio button is with semi-monthly. If I'm looking quickly, I'm not going to accidentally make a change. If I have large areas and small areas, it might be beneficial as to start to line things up. And I'm going to come over here real quick. And if I go 275 and reload, you can see how it starts to line items up. The downside is it's pushing some things off onto separate lines, and we have to kind of worry about that a little bit. We have to think about what's the best way of handling that. So if I want to specify a minimum width, that is something I have to kind of think about and I need to be very careful of. I'm going to come back here and actually make it smaller just so I can work with that. I don't want to push things around too much. I'm going to give a margin for my bottom of 10 pixels. Notice with the smaller minimum size, I still spread things out, but not so much. I keep things in the right lines. If I'm bigger than that minimum width, then it pushes me past. But now because I have that margin on the bottom, I've pushed the content down a little bit. And so this, I think, is a big benefit for me. Another thing I like to do is I like to add a required class. And my required class is going to be something that's going to go on a label. And so I might specify the fact that this is a label and required. And I've not added this yet, but I want to make it obvious that, hey, this is some content that needs to be filled out. And so I will do something like, say, color red. Usually people, if they see red on a form, they know, oh, I'm supposed to fill this out. This is required. And so if I come back, for example, to my form, I have my label for full name, and I'm going to put class required. And I'm also going to add this to password and, of course, other form fields that I want to have required. Using a select, especially if I have a default value, or using radio buttons with default values, that's a great way to ensure that I get a value. And whether it's the correct value or not, I don't know. What I cannot do is do real good data checking to see, like, oh, here's a full name, I put a blank space in it, you filled something out. I don't know that. The required class only makes it display as required. If I actually want to not process this if they didn't fill it out, then I'm going to need to use either JavaScript or something on my server side to actually make it required. This is only for visual purposes. If I reload that, you can see how it's going to show up differently. Some people will make the non-required not bold and required labels to be bold and red, or they'll put a star on them, or they'll do something else. Those are all valid and legitimate ways of laying this out. Another thing that I like to style always is my buttons. I want my buttons to be big and obvious. So I'm going to do a button. And I may, if I'm using buttons in other places on my website, I may need to have a button submit or a form button. The button.submit, obviously submit would be a class I apply to it. That's really up to you. But I'm going to do some basic things just to make it a little bit bigger and easier to click on. I'm going to add padding of 10 pixels. Font size, I'm just going to make it just a little bit bigger, so once it gets a little bit easier to see. My border radius, I'm going to do 10 pixels just so I give a little bit rounded border. And you can kind of see how this works. Okay, so it's a very obvious type of thing, and this works very well for me. Now I can't say, oh, I didn't see that submit button. In fact, I may want to make the padding a little bit smaller, and that's fine too. But I want to make this obvious for people to see. I could also go so far as to add a background image or do some shading with a gradient in my background color just to make it look a little bit more three-dimensional. And that's, of course, always fine as well. Now, I want to probably put a hover effect over it. And if you remember correctly, if I use an input of type button, submit, or reset, I get a simple hover effect. So I'm going to do that with CSS as well. You might say, well, how do you do that? You say, well, I remember a hover for a link, and I'll tell you what, it's the exact same thing. I say button, hover. And now I have that pseudo class that's attached to the button. And that pseudo class can be attached literally to any tag, not just the link. So here we're going to do it on a button. And for simplicity's sake, I'm going to choose the background color. And I'm going to make it black. And my regular color, I'll make white. Just to make sure that it's seen. Of course, I'm going to probably, and realistically, I'm going to try to pick something that's going to fit better in with the color scheme of my website. But now that I reload, you can see that, hey, this is clearly a hover type effect. Now, you might say, well, I'm still seeing the arrow pointer. Can you change that? And the answer is actually yes, you can. So if I come over here and say cursor, so I've changed the cursor to now be pointer, and it doesn't have to be pointer. There's a lot of different values I can have. You can kind of see some of the different ones that you might find. I'm going to do that pointer though. Reload the screen, and now when I put my cursor over the button, it changes to a little finger pointer. And so it now is, that's the pointer. Before it was the arrow, and I have crosshairs, I have a variety of different things I can pick. But this is what people expect. This is just a way to let the end user know that this is a clickable item. They can click on it, and it's going to submit the form. Obviously, we don't have that form processor, so it's not going to actually work. But it's a good way just to kind of work with and test that. And that's how we can start to style our form, just make it a little bit easier to use. And you can do a lot of different things with your form, whether you're changing your required colors or putting a slight rounded edge on items. Whatever you want to do, you have that ability with CSS.